When people think about retirement, they mostly look at whether they can afford it. They plan out long term savings and hope that when they get to their golden years, that money will be enough. But how much is enough? Well, that somewhat depends on what you want to do in retirement. In episode 125, I talked about planning for what to do in retirement, but to figure out how to use that to determine how much is enough, I talked with financial advisor Jeffery Panik on solving that puzzle. What if your retirement plan actually fit your life and not just your spreadsheet? Today's guest, Jeff Panik, is a 25-year financial advisor, U.S. Army veteran, and the founder of Balanced Wealth Partners. Known for breaking down complex topics into real-life solutions, Jeff helps pre-retirees align their money with their values, goals, and family priorities. If you're feeling overwhelmed by Social Security decisions, Medicare puzzles, or succession plans, Jeff's here to make it all make sense. You'll walk away smarter and more confident about your future. Welcome to the show, Jeff.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks for having me today.
It's interesting because, and I have a couple guests, you one, and I'm going to be interviewing another one soon that have come from the military into personal finance, which is a very interesting uh, move from one to the other. So before
Yes.
we start getting into the topic of fitting these puzzle pieces together, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? How did you go from the Army into the field of financial planning?
Yeah, so it's kind of not something that you really think of as you kind of launch out of the military, what you're going to do as next steps.
Mm-hmm.
The main reason, or one of the primary reasons why I went into financial services was because of the sheer lack of knowledge that I had getting out of college. I was the first one to go to college in my family. Didn't really have any real resources or people, we would say mentors, that could really help me, uh, teach me lessons, people that I could bounce ideas off of. And so I ended up with, probably about $80,000 in loans, student loans, and not a whole lot of experience or ability to be able to pay Sally Mae, which is the loan servicer. And
Mm-hmm.
the Army had a program where if you went in for a period of time, they paid off your student loans. And, you got a lot of real practical experience, which is probably, I always say the time I spent in the military was far, I learned probably about three times as much as I did in college.
Mm-hmm.
Just how to deal with people and just the relationships that you build over time from all kinds of socioeconomic backgrounds. And when I was in the military, I was really curious because of the mistakes that I made while I was in college, understanding just basic finance. And the more I learned, I became more interested. And as I was getting out of the Army, there was a firm that had a 3-year training program that was structured, which, if you've ever gotten out of the military, you can know it's a little daunting because you're going from something with a lot of structure to what do I do now?
Mm-hmm.
And, the benefit of this program was it was very structured and it really taught the lessons that you would need to be successful in financial services.
Mm-hmm. So we went from college to Army to then financial services, right?
Correct.
Were you ROTC in college, or did you
No.
decide to enlist after
No,
graduation?
so I was probably the last person that anyone would think I would ever get up at like 5 or 5:30 in the morning, and so it was really a shock in some ways, a good way, because the military, the Army really woke me up to what real life was. I in college you're kind of sheltered a bit, and coming out of that, in some ways I look at it as a blessing that I had the loans because it kind of pushed me in a direction that I would have probably not otherwise went.
Mhm. So you decided because of you graduated college, you weren't sure what to do, and the Army presented you with a way of learning a little bit more about life, I guess,
Yes,
and
learning
and
about
also
life.
paying off your student loans.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the first time that I ever was on the airplane was going to basic training, to give you an idea. So I really never really traveled. I mean, went just very small distances from where I grew up in southwestern Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, a bit sheltered from the perspective of the overall world and being around other people. And so I really believe the military and the Army in particular really gave me the skills in a lot of ways. With finance, you have to know the different, you have to know the ins and outs, but you also have to know how to deal with people. And it's real more behavior than anything else. And I think that's one of the better skills that I received from the military was just how to interact with people that have completely different backgrounds. And really coming out of that, I had interest, like I mentioned, in finance, and I came across the program, and it's kind of all worked out for me at this point.
Mhm. Did you learn some of this stuff about personal finance or whatever while you were in the Army that kind
Yeah,
of piqued your interest, or did
yeah,
that happen after
I
you mustered out?
no, I did, and it's you always have there's obviously the library, there's magazines, everything else. I was in Korea and a few other places where it was a kind of a cultural shock, so it was easy to go to the library on the base and kind of look at things and kind of learn from there,
Mhm.
and really kind of sparked my interest.
Mhm.
And I thought, the benefit of the business financial services is it's constantly evolving with tax changes, with different new strategies. And so
Mhm.
you have to, it's really constant learning. And so that's one of the other things that attracted me to it, because
Mhm.
you always have to stay on your toes and you always have to be really proactive as an advisor, just like you had to be in the military. I mean, you always want to stay on your toes, not on your heels.
So this is more general knowledge than something that arose out of your MOS in the Army.
Yeah, so it's funny. My MOS was ground surveillance. So that's been since replaced by the drones.
Hmm.
So it no longer, I believe, even exists, the MOS that I was in. So really, it was more of a matter of with ground surveillance and intelligence. I could have went in that direction further, but really, I was more interested of getting out, paying off my student loans once they were paid off. Really
Hmm.
going into civilian life and trying to do the best I could,
Hmm.
with putting college and the military together in one kind of package moving forward.
Okay, so you learned that in while you're in the Army, and then you saw that this field, and I guess in particular this program, would continue that structure for you
Yes.
coming out. So you went
Yes.
into that program. You said it was a 3 year program,
Yes.
or
Correct.
okay.
Yeah. So it was 3 year, they would help you get your licenses. They would pay a certain amount of a salary to you. So
Mhm.
it was a transition, so it made it easier to kind of transition over at the same time have certain templates and certain benchmarking that you could use to, make sure you were progressing the right way.
Right.
And it's important starting out in any industry to be able to be exposed and be able to understand all the moving parts of something, because again, it's something that was completely foreign to me, not the topics necessarily, but just how you manage everything. And
Mhm.
I look at when I started, you would get a message from someone, and as someone, an administrative assistant would take the message slip, which was a
Mhm.
pink slip, and they would give it to you. And if you weren't there, you might not be in the office for a couple of days. You'd return the call in 2 or 3 days, or whenever you would be back in the office. Now, the conversation now is almost instantaneous, or with the expectations have been moved up with technology.
Mhm.
So whether it's the internet, or whether it's just the way productivity, it's really shifted in most businesses, in particular in the financial services business.
Mhm. Yeah, it's both a blessing and a curse because
Yes.
now, although you had that time, you may not get back to them for another couple of days, whatever. But now with email, with texting,
Yes.
with everything else, there's a much higher expectation of response. So the communication is faster, but then that could be an issue as well, just trying to keep
Ex
up.
ex exactly. And it goes back to communication. I mean, I think that's the critical in whatever profession you do, wherever you are in life,
Hmm.
whether it's a relationship or business,
Hmm.
professional relationship, communication is really key.
Hmm.
When you start not communicating, that's where you get into assuming and misunderstanding. And that oftentimes creates a lot, it creates just issues that can kind of cascade from there.
Hmm.
And that's one of the things I've kind of tried to do with relationships with clients, is try to set the relationship so everyone knows what the responsibilities are, as
Hmm.
well as know what the communication is. And a lot of times people will get things typically Friday night and they're not sure what to do.
Mhm.
If you, I always say, if you're ever worried, you want to make sure you call the advisor or the person that you deal with. And, if they don't get back to you in a timely manner, 24 to 48 hours, you really need to kind of reassess because, they're there, to try to help guide you through life or whatever, you're trying to do, whatever your goal is and objective.
Mhm.
And if, they're not really kind of there, that's not really probably the best relationship or a relationship that probably will last over the long run.
Right. All right, so we're here to talk about in this episode about solving the retirement lifestyle puzzle.
Yes.
But I think before we get to that part, as we talked before I hit record, as a young person, you come out of college like you did, not necessarily knowing a lot of stuff. You got to walk before you run. So before
Yes.
you start solving that puzzle, you have to kind of learn the basics, right? And I
Yeah.
understand you have
No.
a book and some help for young people with that. Tell us a little bit about that
Yes.
book and how you
Yes.
help people to get those initial skills and
Yes.
get walking so they can then start
No,
running.
and it's a big challenge. I mean, at this point, I believe there's only about 22 states that actually have a financial literacy requirement to graduate high school. A lot
Mm-hmm.
of them, they have waivers on where you can get a waiver so you don't even have to go through the class.
Mm-hmm.
And the one thing that's certain is whether it's student loans, whether it's credit card debt, whether it's home formation, there is something missing. There's a critical gap between what someone, a young adult, needs coming out of high school or college and what they're getting in school as it relates to consumer finance. And, I looked at my background and how I just didn't know anything. And I was just kind of, it was like with finance, I was banging around with the lights off in the dark. I mean, that's really the way I was. And that's the way I feel a lot of people getting out of school are, they just sign documents, student loan documents. They don't probably even look at what they're even signing. They go to this library to get books and there's people there trying to sell them credit cards. It's
Mm-hmm.
just very, unless you're ahead of it. And you mentioned walking before running. The analogy I always use, like we talked about before, is really life is really a marathon. It's not a sprint. If you try to rush through something, you're usually going to end up kicking yourself later. And unfortunately, or fortunately for certain people, if their family group, if they have a family where they know they're knowledgeable about finance and money, usually they're going to be on better footing than someone that is coming from a background where, the parents are, working, they don't really have time to talk about it, they don't really necessarily understand it themselves. And you really start, the other group that has the infrastructure, where they have the family, where they understand what to do and how to move that we would say the chessboard, they're probably on about mile 15, when a lot of people that are just behind the curve or at the beginning of the race. So the longer you stand there, the harder it is to catch up really. And so, I wrote the book where it tries to cover most pieces of what I would call finance of someone getting out to try to simplify, whether it's simply writing a check and explaining what a check is, or
Mm-hmm.
whether it's how do you buy a car, what type of insurance do you get on the car, how do you set up an account, a bank account even, and how do you manage debt, how do you understand, understanding student loans and credit cards, and just trying to give a good background for someone or a framework for someone that's coming from having zero knowledge on the topic of finance or consumer finance. And I've said you could Google most financial topics and get about 300 million hits on it, but for it to actually, and then you get all the sponsors that are trying to sell you something, for you to actually get down to the point where you can understand how it's going to benefit you, it's extremely difficult.
Mm-hmm. So you have this book, and I'll leave a link in the show notes for the listeners who want to. You're young, you're starting to figure this stuff out, or you're the parent of someone that's graduating college. Get a copy of that book, take a look at it, and get those basics down.
Mhm.
So let's move on to this lifestyle puzzle.
Yes.
Obviously, and I've talked in previous episodes, and we talked before I hit record that the sooner you start saving for retirement, the better
Yes.
because you graduate college and you plan on retiring at age 65, the traditional, at least for now, retirement age. So you got a good 40 years ahead of you. So the sooner you start, the better. But then the question becomes, how much money do I need? you know,
Exactly. Well, yeah, and
how
that's
do I know? Let's start with the end in mind. How much am I going to need? And is it 1 million? Is it 2 million?
yeah.
And of course, the answer is it depends.
Yeah, it depends. Yeah, it depends. And really, I look at it and say I could have 1,000 people that come to meet me, and they have 1,000 different solutions or
Mm,
answers to that question. And a lot of it comes down to, I mean, some of it, as you mentioned before, comes back to doing the right things, or having someone that helps you do the right things, because sometimes it's really confusing. The earlier you start saving, like you mentioned before, you have a thing called compounding, and compound interest over time. The sooner that you start putting money in there, the easier it is to reach goals 40 years that you're not even thinking about.
mm,
And it also is the reverse of that. The longer that you wait, the harder it is to make up for the lost time. And time, as you know, has a way of getting away, where it's like a blink of an eye, really, life. And coming up to retirement, people say, well, what's my number? How much income do I need? Well, a lot of it comes down to I look at debt, I look at what your expectations are in retirement. Look at longevity. You look at inflation, which I used to talk about inflation and people would like not really understand.
mm,
Now, if you look at a gallon of milk, or if you look at eggs or anything else, you understand what inflation is. And so that gets into saving early, having compound interest, trying to get to where you need to be in terms of the overall savings. The question is, well, how do you do that? Well, it's different for everyone. And it's really a matter of, do you have a lot of people are having children later? Are you going to think about retiring and you still have children to pay for, like in college? Or, do you have debt? You have a second home or a business? What are the issues that you have that need to be really addressed first? And really, I get back to looking at, I call it a financial life inventory plan.
mm,
It's a lot like if you've ever lived somewhere for 20, 30 years or even less, and you go to move and you're like, I have all this stuff I forgot about. I don't know where it is. I don't know how to put it together. What boxes, how do you organize it? It's a lot like your finances, where really you have to be a little bit methodical with it, and you have to take a little bit of time to work through all these different pieces so that you can come up and understand, how much income you can expect to have. Is it going to be enough? Do you need to think about maybe working longer? Maybe we also call it like downshifting, where maybe not having the full-time stress of a job, but maybe downshifting into something that would be part-time. Getting into healthcare, that's one of the largest expenses in retirement, especially for someone that maybe is thinking about retiring before 65. How do you pick up the healthcare retiree benefits? How does that all work? And you get into Medicare, Social Security. It's really a little bit different for everyone,
mm,
based upon what their family situation is.
mm,
And it's that I can say that because that's kind of what the reality is. And everybody has, I think, a unique. It's almost like DNA. And I really look at your financial puzzle, your retirement, as really your own DNA. And I think sometimes people sometimes get so focused on the number, they forget about the lifestyle side. And we were talking about that earlier. You could have all the money in the world, but if you haven't really been around your spouse or significant other, if you're in a relationship and all of a sudden, you're 24/7 with each other because you're both done working, you can have a lot of problems that come along and be pretty miserable. And so I think part of planning for retirement has to do with not just money, but also your life after. And kind of I mentioned before, a lot of people get to the point where they could potentially live longer in retirement than their working years.
mm,
And the more that you can plan ahead, whether it's volunteering, whether it's downshifting, like I mentioned, hobbies, spending more time with family, the more that you can kind of carve things out that you enjoy, the much happier you'll be in retirement. And I think
mm,
not only will you be happy, but your family would be happy as well.
mm. And we go back to communication. I mean, you talked about the married couple and the kids
Yeah.
are grown, and they move out of the house. And there have been some statistics that show that there's sort of a spike in divorces a
Yes.
certain number of years into the marriage because the kids are gone, and now they're back to being with each other 24/7 and
Yes.
not running around with the
And
kids and everything else. And now what do you do? And you start realizing that maybe a lot of the things or problems, etc., that were sort of pushed aside as you're dealing with raising children are now in the forefront. So talking about what retirement looks like earlier on, and what your goals are and are they in line with each other can be
yeah.
very important, right?
Yeah, I mean, I use the example of, if you have a couple, one wants to move to the beach, the other wants to move to the mountains, or they want to stay still, there's going to be a lot of friction there, especially, it would be great if everyone has enough money to have a beach house, a regular house, these kind of things, but most people don't. And really, it's a matter of having an open conversation with it. The other thing I always say is, if you, a lot of times people will have almost like, when they have certain places they go on vacation often and they just love the place, but they're there for a week or a weekend. I always say it's a good idea to get an Airbnb for a couple weeks and see what it's like to be there for a longer period of time. And I
Mm-hmm.
always suggest renting as opposed to buying right away, really giving you an idea. And I tell people, look at three or four different places you may not even think about, but test them out.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like taking a car for a test drive. The more this is a place that you're going to live for a long period of time. Last thing you want to do is move a bunch of times because you're
Right.
you're not happy with the place.
Mm-hmm.
And the one thing too, you never want to be in a position where you buy something and you have to turn around and sell it because you're unhappy within a very small amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
And so, these little things that you can do getting ahead of retirement, it will prepare you to be in a much better position to feel really comfortable and not really, staying awake at night worried about things that could be addressed, a few years before you approach. And the other side of it is there are some people, they say, I'm just going to work, I'm not going to really think about it. Well, typically your health or your employer kind of override it, whether you have a health issue or your employer says, you're not really productive anymore. We're just going to part ways, so whether you like it or not, at some point you really have to address how you're going to transition to retirement. And the less you address it, the more friction and the more problematic it's going to be.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly, and we also talked about this before we hit record, and I had talked about it with a previous guest about, you know, if your life is tied up in your job and your career, and that is kind of who you are, when that
Yes.
job goes away, you're left casting around wondering, who am I? What do I do? Where does my life go from here? And I mentioned like you were in the army, the military. If you rise in rank, you were a career army or whatever branch of the military, and you were in charge of a lot of people. You're very important, and then you retire. You're dropping off a cliff. There's
Yep.
nothing there. So maybe something for the younger folks to think about. Like I said, you're investing early. You start
Hmm.
figuring out your number.
Yes.
uh, Maybe instead of watching golf, start playing it a little bit
Yeah.
more. Figure
Playing
out,
golf. Yeah.
right, what are your hobbies? What are you
Yes.
interested in? Get into that as far as activities. Get into social activities, joining organizations, being active there, creating a social structure or network for yourself that you can continue to enjoy in retirement and sort of extrapolate that on. And that gets you thinking about what your participation in that hobby or organization is going to be after retirement, which then helps you figure out your number, right?
Exactly. And I mean, the one thing that I will mention too that I didn't mention before, I think is extremely important is to have what I'd like to call an accountability partner.
Mm-hmm.
And that necessarily might not be a spouse. It may be someone like that is in my position as a financial advisor or someone that's trying to help you through come up with a retirement plan,
Mm-hmm.
but really someone that can help you define goals and keep you on time. Because it's easy to kind of, especially if you get into we call legacy estate planning, certain areas that people don't really like to think about as they're getting older, like death, disability, these things that are still important. It's important for someone to be really, I would call it the person that is making sure that you check the boxes that you need to check to try to get you to the point where you're ready for the transition.
Mm-hmm.
And, it like in anything else, whether it's a mentor, accountability partner, the benefit of the internet these days are there are just a lot of resources out there especially, you mentioned volunteering. There's all kinds of things that you can do for mentoring and volunteering.
Hmm.
You can even do it via Zoom as an example. And so really it's a matter of finding several things that you enjoy to work through. There's even education. I believe in lifelong learning.
Hmm.
There's no shortage of adult lifelong learning programs that you can go through and build a new skill. And maybe something you not even think about, maybe even gardening or something like that that you
Hmm.
enjoy. Uh, but the benefit of these things are that there's a lot to take advantage of. The problem is there's just so many things. Where do you begin? And
Hmm.
that's what I found over and over. It's kind of like a paralysis because you don't even know where to start.
Hmm.
And I compare it to, like I said, moving, because it's like, well, we sold our house, we have to get out of here. Where do we even begin?
Right.
That's similar to that.
Well, and as those years, you start young, you start at age 24, 25, and you have 40 years to retirement. There has to be some flexibility. There are going to be course corrections in the
Yes.
sort of that in the course of that period of time between now and retirement. And if there's a spouse, that communication I think needs to you need to kind of sound out what your flexibility is. You talked about either relocating or what you want to do or where you want to relocate to. You mentioned inflation. Well, yeah, there are some areas that are more retirement friendly than others, and you have kind of that flexibility as you're 5, 6, 7 years out, and
Yes.
you're saying, okay, we're closer to our number. This is what we roughly have. Is that going to be enough for where we are, or do we need to move somewhere where the cost of living is lower, where that number will work there, which might not work here? And you
Exactly. And that's a
communicate
great
with your
point.
spouse to make sure you're both comfortable with doing that and
Mhm.
making those course corrections, right?
Yeah, there's no question, and that's a great point. I mean, really, communication is everything. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it can't be understated enough in business, especially, but in a relationship more so than anything. Divorce typically centers around an issue with communication, and then you layer on top money, and you
Mm-hmm.
put those two together, and it's like, it's being thrown in a wood chipper, if you miscommunicate.
Yeah.
So, I can't say enough. And again, part of it they say is opposites attract. And
Mm-hmm.
that's good in some ways because it keeps you motivated. But at
Mm-hmm.
the same time, I use for especially young adults starting out, the people they're often attracted to have completely different viewpoints or even backgrounds with money.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the biggest challenges is, saving how you do that, what the background is from each person's family could be very different. So it's a matter of combining households, putting it together and coming up with a plan moving forward, which is often difficult
Mm-hmm.
because different people want different things, especially based upon their background. It's the same really going into retirement because people are often so focused on work, on their children, getting them to where they need to be so they can be successful adults, that
Mm-hmm.
they really forget to get to their ducks in order coming up to retirement. And so I think more and more people are thinking about it now because obviously, I think with the government debt the way it is right now, and with just some of the concerns about some of the programs out there, it's really important to try to understand if you can be independent and
Mm-hmm.
understand, like you said, certain course corrections, whether it's moving, whether it's working longer, or coming up with a strategy that works if it's a couple or an individual.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked about, starting young, being flexible, communicating as you go along, but at some point, things are going to start gelling and starting to set, and you're 5 to 7 years out from retirement. Uh, let's talk now about how to fit those puzzle pieces together once they're going to start locking into place, as it were.
Yes.
You have you may have a lot less flexibility per se, 5 to 7 years out, but you also have a better idea of the amount that you have saved
Mhm.
versus what you'll need.
Yes.
So tell us about 5 to 7 years out, fitting those puzzle pieces together. What should people do?
Yeah, so I mean, we've talked about the lifestyle side already. Obviously, at that point, you want to start looking at the different things that you want to do post retirement. You
Mm-hmm.
also, at that point, want to look at your debt. You want to look at what your assets are and what your income is. And then you want to look at your different income sources in retirement.
Mm.
It used to be everyone had a pension, or 95% of people had pensions. Now it's very rare. And I always use the example of a chair. The more legs to the chair, the more stable it's going to be. So
Mm.
really what you want to do is look and you would say, how can I get my chair as stable as it possibly can be? Whether it's reducing debt, whether it's putting more away, whether it's saying, well, we're not going to work full time, but we may work less, but we're still going to work a little bit into retirement. These are the realities. And, you have to look really, like I mentioned, at longevity and planning and understanding that everyone's living a whole lot longer. And, if you do the right things with your health, that's the other thing with health. At that point, you have 5 or 7 years and the kids are hopefully adults, successful. You want to look at your health as well.
Mm.
Are there certain things that you maybe need to do, going into retirement to better take care of yourself?
Mm.
Because again, when you're in your 20s and 30s, I'm not sitting there in the young adult book saying, you need to get to the gym every day, you need to stretch every day, you need to do that, because you have, you're young, you can kind of do that. As you get older, it's important to really focus on your health, both mentally and physically. That's, I think, another component. You get into what are you going to do post-retirement? Part of pre-retirement is making sure that if you need to do something or you're constantly, you're going to the doctor regularly, you're getting checkups, you're doing things, in groups where you can kind of work through maybe the time that you didn't have to get to the point where you'll be in a physically a better position to enjoy retirement.
Mm.
The last thing you want to do is be miserable for 20 or 25 years because you have, physical ailments and issues.
Mhm. All right. So you wrote, we mentioned your first book, which is for the young people on how to get started and deal with the basics, but you have a second book, right? Is that for
Yes.
the older folks that are at this point in their lives, 5 to 7 years out? Tell us about that
Correct.
book and how it helps folks.
Yes. So like we've been talking about, I really view pre-retirement planning as really a puzzle. And
Hmm.
I say whether it's assets, a lot of times with assets, people collect assets like antiques, stamps,
Hmm.
coins. It's a matter of kind of putting all those together and see how they work. A
Hmm.
lot of times I'll have people work at 2 or 3 different companies. They may have 2 or 3 different pensions. How does that work?
Hmm.
Do you have, if you're divorced, do you have different social security benefits that you should be looking at? Or if you're widowed, is there a survivor benefit, Medicare? The biggest thing that I see a lot, people think that they're just going to shift to Medicare at 65 and it's going to be free. Well, that's not the case. Sometimes if you're going to continue to work, it would make sense to stay on your employer plan. So there are a lot of things really, as I mentioned before in the book, I have a template that I use for the financial life inventory plan that you can work through that really, and some of it doesn't apply. If you don't have a business, your business interests aren't, you don't really have, you can just check through and move on.
Hmm.
But what it is designed to do is try to give someone that's saying, I have all these pieces. How do I try to at least have a template that I can use to put them together?
Hmm.
And hopefully coming out of that, you can have an understanding of, what do you have to start dumping more money in savings? Do you pay down debt? Do you do a balance of the two? Do you continue maybe saying, well, I'm not going to work at the pace I'm working now, but I'm going to downshift a bit, work a little longer, because it's like anything else. Typically, the longer you work, you can kind of solve for any deficit because you're not having to take out of your retirement savings and typically you're going to be able to put more into it.
Hmm. And just a couple other pieces of the puzzle too. I mean, for example, if you own your own business and
Mhm.
you're retiring from your business, you really need a succession plan.
Yes.
Now,
And
what happens to the business? Do the kids take it over? Do you just shut it down? Or is it an asset you can sell? And you need to start thinking about that as you like I'm looking to retire in a couple of years. Lawyers just can't retire. They have to there's a transition and you need to
exactly.
have a plan. So that and you mentioned pensions. Fewer employers have pensions, but there are also annuities, which I say,
Yes.
is a simpler form of
Yes.
a pension. And
Yes.
maybe as you're 5 to 7 years out, start looking at rebalancing that investment portfolio to maybe put some money into an annuity and to get an idea of how much that income that annuity is going to give you every month, and how that puzzle piece fits into your retirement. So your business and sort of your own little, especially
And
if you're
yeah,
self-employed.
especially with the business, I mean that is one of the things that I see often where there's not a good successor to the business. You know,
Hmm.
people are hoping that their children will come on board, but it never often works out.
Hmm.
And the worst thing you can do is have a health issue or have an issue where you have to sell. You know, really having the 3 to 5 year timeline can work very well where you come up to that point, you can have the business valued properly. You
Hmm.
can take your time and find the right buyer, whether it's internally, you know, where you could get someone that works for you that can find financing, or
Hmm.
whether it's externally, you know, because for most business owners, you know, that's really their biggest asset.
Hmm.
And to not take advantage of that because of timing is really unfortunate. You
Hmm.
know, the other point of it you mentioned is really the 3 to 5 years with investments. You can get into what we call sequence of return risk,
Hmm.
meaning that you know you're maybe too aggressive and you come up into a situation where you have a big drop in the market
Hmm.
right when you're starting to start withdrawing money. And so
Yes.
that's not that is a big risk for a lot of people. And so you just don't have the time to sit there and make up because you're taking money out, which makes it much more difficult to get back to where you were before the market decline. And so you know, you really it's dependent upon the person's specific situation. In that case, I can't really give it, you know, guidance on the annuities here, but really what you want to do is just understand, and it's almost like buckets. You want to have various buckets to pull the money from and understand not only where you're pulling the money from, but how much you're going to have at the end. The other thing that we talk about too is taxes. You know, everybody's aware of taxes, but you know they're not often aware that you know the social you pay taxes on your Social Security if you're above a certain amount of income. You know the money that you've put into your retirement account, if it's pre-tax or tax deferred, you know the government wants their piece of the pie when you take the money out. So you know you may be thinking, I'm going to get 5,000 out of the account. Well, you know if that's what you can take, you have to take the taxes off the top of it. So
Right.
you know these are things that you don't always think about, but you know, you have to factor the government, you have to factor what they get, and you have to make sure that you have enough after that, plus factoring what the risks are. You know, what is the risk of running out of money? You know,
Hmm.
and you want to understand that and have eyes wide open to understand, well, you know, there's nothing's perfect. There's no perfect strategy, which lies in where it may make sense to have a bunch of several different strategies that are working together.
Hmm. Okay, well, we've talked about both your books, and we'll have links in the show notes on that. But other than that, how do you tell us a little bit about how you help folks beyond the books, and if people are interested in talking to you,
Sure.
how can they get in touch?
Sure. So my firm, Balance Wealth Partners, I've had it for about 8 years now,
Hmm.
and I've been in the industry for more than 25 years. I'm a certified financial planner and have a master's in financial planning. And really, what I try to do with people is try to sit down and get an understanding of what they're trying to do. A lot of times, they just say, "I just need to do this, but I'm not sure how." And I
Hmm.
try to work with them, almost like I mentioned before, to be an accountability partner, you
Hmm.
know, and not draw, you know, not hit them in the head with a hammer, but try to push them along
Right.
really to get a good outcome. You know, and
Hmm.
that outcome could be different for, you know, two different people have two different outcomes that they're looking for.
Right.
But really to try to go into whatever they're looking to do, whether, you know, if they're younger, looking to fund education or looking to buy, you know, buy a home. A lot of times it used to be you take that for granted. Now, you know, it could take 10 or 15 years to try to, you know, put away enough money to do that. You know, really everyone's in a little bit different spot. But as it relates to retirement, really lay out what your picture is because, or puzzle, put it together. And it's really never perfect, but it really is a matter of at least after you lay out the puzzle, you actually understand hopefully where you stand and
Hmm.
how you can move forward.
Okay. Well, we'll put all those resources in the show notes, folks, for the listeners out there, and be sure to check them out so that you can fix and start thinking about this stuff now. You don't want to be trying to puzzle through it a couple years before retirement, or God forbid, after you have. The sooner you start working on this and do whatever course corrections you have to do, the better off you are. So, thanks for coming on the show. Appreciate all the great information, and I'm sure you've helped out a lot of folks out there.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks for having me today.